my 3-year-old son would openly tell you that his dad's favorite animal is the dingo, and he says, "My favorite animal is the dingo too, and the koala too." I was like, "Okay, cool. You got a lot of favorite
We
animals."
can have multiple favourites. Nothing wrong with that.
Where does your love for the dingo come from?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. One thing that was amazing for me was that when I first started my university degree at James Cook University in Townsville, fresh face from Melbourne, moving up to far north Queensland, just almost a completely different place for me. I remember vividly, I think it was on the first or second night at the gatehouse at James Cook University, as I was driving through, there was literally a dingo at the gatehouse. So imagine, a Melbourne University or a Monash, and you're driving through the front and you see a dingo there. People would be like freaking out, like what's going on? In Townsville, that's just kind of normal
Wow.
because it's kind of this more remote place and you have a lot more wildlife in and around the campus. And so that was, I guess, my first connection basically with the dingo. But then in 2008, I was lucky enough to get a postdoctoral position studying dingoes. And that's really where my love of dingoes first started out. But to me, they're just the most amazing animal to work on for so many reasons. Aside from sort of, their ecology and what their role is as a top predator in the environment, they also open up so many other conversations because they'd have to be the animal that evokes the most number of emotions I've ever seen for any animal in terms of controversies, so people love them, people hate them, and everything in between. They impact the livestock industry, but they also have really important cultural values of First Nations peoples. So everybody's got an opinion about dingoes, and we're still learning a lot about them. And I think they really help us to have big conversations too about the environment, about colonialism, about all these things that are really important and topical conversations of the day. So they open up all those kind of conversations. So look, I think they're just a fabulous animal, and I'll never get sick of working on them. And they're just beautiful. Like there's no disputing that. If you're out in the middle of the arid zone or even the alpine zone or even rainforest, they occur across a whole range of different environments and you're lucky enough to see one. It's a really, really wonderful experience.
You got the alpine dingo, which is more white, yeah?
Yeah, tending to be somewhat white, but they can also be really variable in the colour, even the alpine zone, but heavier. So if you see a dingo in the sort of the arid zone, they're typically around sort of 15 kilos or so, and they kind of, in some ways, look like a bit like a scrawny kelpie, right? That kind of classic build. Mm-hmm. If you see a dingo in the alpine zone, it's a much heavier set animal, and so upwards around 20 kilos. Mm-hmm. So quite a big difference in body size. And of course, they're heavier set because they need to be warm, right? They're living in areas where there's snow. So even though they're one species, there's a lot of variation in how dingoes look right across the Australian landscape.
So language is really important when we're talking about wildlife. Tell me about the use of language like wild dogs when describing dingoes.
Yeah, look, it's a really problematic and complex issue. So you'll often hear dingoes being referred to as wild dogs. And I think in the past, maybe that was done fairly innocently. People just sort of didn't really know that there were differences. And I think now, that there's a real problem associated with that term. So you'll often hear people use the word wild dog in a very sort of negative way. Wild dogs causing these issues and wild dogs doing that and we should control wild dogs, et cetera, et cetera. But dingoes get lumped in with wild dogs. And there's been a lot of research that's been done recently by independent scientists and groups, genetic research, looking at dingo populations right across Australia. And what it shows is that the vast majority of animals out there are dingoes in a genetic sense. So they're not feral dogs. They're not even hybrids. So, in studies where they've looked at hundreds of individuals, it's very, very rare to find a true hybrid, which is a 50-50 cross, so a domestic dog and a dingo. They basically found that the vast majority of individuals were in fact dingoes. And so I think we need to be really honest about if we're killing, inverted commas, wild dogs to protect livestock, then we're killing dingoes, and we need to be honest about that. And I think, again, it's really, really important to recognise that, First Nations peoples take a lot of offence at, them being referred to as wild dogs because in many cases they refer to dingoes as being kin, family. And so when they're being hurt, they feel like they're being hurt. And obviously that opens up really quite horrible conversations about how they've been treated themselves. So I think, we don't dispute the fact that, you know, dingoes can have impacts on livestock. And occasionally there might be small numbers of feral dogs that do the same, but we should just be really clear about how we use our language. Of course, the public perceives things differently too. So that if you say to, I think most people in the street, tell me what you think about dingoes, I think a lot of people would be quite positive about that. If you say, what do you think about wild dogs? I think you'd get a different response. And so people can manipulate that. And I think we just need to be more honest about the language that we use.
So there are a lot of pests out there.
There are.
And we use poison baits to help with that. How does 1080 work with wild dogs and pests and dingoes?
Yeah, so we've had really devastating impacts, particularly by foxes and cats, on our native wildlife. And Australia has the worst record for conservation of mammals in the world in recent times. So only about 40 species have been driven to extinction in the last couple of hundred years in Australia. And a large number of those is because of cats and foxes. And so 1080, which is this chemical that's actually derived from native Australian plants that a lot of native animals have a tolerance to varying degrees, is actually very effective at killing pest animals, introduced animals like foxes. Unfortunately, it also kills dingoes. And so dingoes are either deliberately targeted with 1080 in some cases, or inadvertently will take a fox bait that will also still kill them. And so, again, as a conservationist, I always sort of start with a position of let's do least harm. But sometimes we have to make hard choices as well about, if we don't control that cat or fox population, then a bilby or a numbat or something other, some other wildlife species may be at risk. We're, of course, moving towards trying to find more humane ways of controlling pest animals because from my own perspective, again, just because something's an introduced species or a pest species, it's not its fault per se. We, the humans, have done the damage. So we should be finding the most humane ways to control these animals. And there's really exciting science that's developing along those lines. So things like gene drive and so forth, where we actually manipulate the genetics of populations to, as an example, make them less able to breed. It's a far more humane way than targeting animals with poison. So 1080 is a fairly excruciating way to die. And I won't go into the details of that because it's really quite traumatic. So I think we're all trying to find ways to, manage pest animals better. We're also trying to find ways to maintain dingoes in the landscape but not have livestock graziers being affected. And I think one of the most exciting approaches to that is using guardian animals. So, the Greeks and the Romans and others have been using guardian animals for a long, long time. So, hundreds of years. And so basically guardian animals, including large dog species. So some people might know the movie Oddball, a large white dog, a Maremma, is the breed of that animal. They're not only able to protect penguins, as in the case of that movie, they can protect livestock against dingoes. We also know that donkeys, believe it or not, can protect livestock too against dingoes. And so there's really interesting things going on in that area where people are taking feral donkeys, which we have a problem with in Australia. So there's really large feral donkey populations in northern and arid Australia and rehoming some of those donkeys. And they're actually really effective at deterring, attacks by dingoes. So, and there's a whole science
That's
around
why I love
too.
this show. Just finding out random.
Yeah,
random
exactly.
facts.
And who doesn't love donkeys, right? So there's a whole science around that too, that if you have too many donkeys, the donkeys just hang out with each other. So you have to have just the right number of donkeys. And then, many people, of course, would have seen alpacas in areas where there's sheep country, right around particularly southern Australia. They're very effective against foxes. They don't really work against dingoes. They're not big enough. But against foxes, they're very effective. So there are tools that we have to protect livestock, but in a way that I would argue is more ethical and still allows us to have things like dingoes in the landscape, which we want their benefits.